Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from or whether you're watching us in replay. And welcome to the next in our Enterprise Risk Management Thought Leadership series. And today we're going to be covering control frameworks, big proliferation of them at the moment. Before we get too deep into this conversation, I'd like to introduce my partner in crime today. We affectionately know him as Cyber Mike. Mike, would you like to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, welcome to the IT webinar. My name is Mike Franklin, as Michael suggested, Cyber Mike. I'm the Cybersecurity Global Lead for Protecht. I'm part of the sales team. However, I've come from a customer with around 15 years of cybersecurity risk management, audit and assurance experience from large tertiary education and banking organizations. I look forward to really going through this webinar with you and stepping through it with my partner in crime, Michael.
Thanks, Cyber Mike. I don't have quite the cool name that you do. So my name is Michael Howe. I'm the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protecht. So that entails primarily looking after our on-demand risk management methodology training and also looking after a lot of our blogs, webinars like this one, a lot of our thought leadership and ebooks. And a bit more about what Protecht does more generally. So we do three main things. One is our Protecht ERM system, which includes enterprise risk management broadly, as well as ISMS, third-party risk management, operational resilience, and all the subcomponents within that. Secondly, we also do our Protecht Academy, which is our on-demand training. It's about changing the hearts and minds of our people. So it's not just about using our systems, but also how we can take people along that risk journey. And finally, our advisory team. So that's about bringing that to life and having our advisors helping people bring things like their risk policies, etc., to life within our platform. So it's really about helping all of our customers along their risk management journey. So in terms of what we're looking at today, a bit of housekeeping. We're going to take around about 60 minutes or so. We do love engaging with our community. So please, you should have a questions box that you can throw questions in. We'll be looking at those and we will be answering those in a blog at the after the webinar has completed. So absolutely please chuck those questions in. We also ask you to stay on the line for a couple of minutes just so that you can complete a post-webinar questionnaire. Helps us understand how valuable you found the webinar, other topics that you'd like to hear about, and again, helps us to continue to engage with our community and provide you valuable content. And finally, as we're always asked, yes, you will be provided the slides after the webinar and have recordings available. So if you either want to watch them in replay or you think they might be valuable to some of your colleagues, then absolutely you'll be able to share them. Because we have some people on the line who are primarily looking at this from an IT perspective, and I know that we'll also have some people on the line from more broader enterprise risk management and operational risk management perspective. And we'll look at bringing some of those things together today. So, Mike, before we jump into our topic, what are some of the things that you're hearing from industry?
Yeah, look, thanks, Michael. We're seeing a shift of really technical outputs to inform business risk conversations, primarily at the executive level, and using the example of the Chief Information Security Officer, we're seeing that interpretation and the translation from those technical issues to ensure that the organization's business objectives are being met. So therefore, we're going from a low-level control against a critical information resource and raising it up to see how they impact a risk and how vitally important it is to understand quickly. Why and how we do this is key and is a focal area for the agenda that Michael will now run through.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And think about those technical outputs you're mentioning. I guess we're talking a bit about frameworks today, and some of those can have quite a lot of technical detail. So it's about how you're pulling that out and making that relevant to the business, I think is that key message.
Yeah, correct.
In terms of the agenda that we're going to be running through today, we're going to cover the why. What are some of the drivers of these control frameworks? Why are we seeing so many of them? We'll cover the what, the relationship between risks, controls, frameworks, how do all those things go together? And then we'll think about how you can manage those frameworks, especially if you're thinking about multiple frameworks. How do you make sure that you can map all those things and manage your assurance as well? We'll cover the who manages those control frameworks, who decides which frameworks you're going to be adhering to potentially. And then we'll briefly cover the controls testing cadence. What are some of the drivers around how frequently you might need to run that testing? And finally, we'll close out with some reporting and how you can think about controls testing, and alignment with frameworks. So let's begin with the why. What are some of these drivers? And there are certainly some regulatory drivers, particularly around the globe. And this is a quick snapshot of some of the regulations or some of the regulators around the globe who are driving for strong cybersecurity postures. And particularly in Europe, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, very strong focus on not just financial services and financial service providers, but also third-party providers to financial services, with a very strong focus on having robust testing in place across that extended enterprise. We're seeing, interestingly, in the US, the FFIEC had their own cyber assessment tool, which they're retiring. And the reason they're retiring that is because there are so many good frameworks out there that said, well, we don't need to create our own anymore. We can just have our entities manage against some of those other frameworks that are out there. So we're seeing a shift now from not just these regulators wanting their own processes, but alignment with a lot of these frameworks. And some of them don't have a specific framework that they're expecting, but for them to meet some of those requirements, to make sure that they are secure, aligning with the framework goes a long way to showing or demonstrating that you're meeting some of those cybersecurity requirements.
Yeah, Michael,
we're seeing a broader step back.
Yeah, we're seeing that at the moment. Actually, I'm speaking to US stakeholders regularly, and I've just seen that today with relation to you're looking for those other frameworks, and this is going to be a great opportunity to look at that.
Yeah, and I guess the regulatory landscape more broadly as well, Mike, is we're seeing just corporate regulators. We're seeing the SEC expecting reporting on not just the material incidents. There's that has, I guess, caused a bit of drivers for making sure people are reporting on their incidents, but also just to report on what does your framework look like? How well are you managing those frameworks? And we've seen even personal liability starting to come to the fore if some of those reporting requirements might be potentially misleading. We've got the SolarWinds and Uber, where we've got CISOs who are potentially have their personal liability on the line as well. And Mike, do you want to talk about APRA CPS 234 and that's the alignment with CPS 230?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. As we're aware, APRA is key for financial services regulators, and look, it is one of those control frameworks that is going to be critical to really becoming more compliant against CPS 230 as an integrated information security framework. But there are others as well we need to consider, for the likes of SOCI, the security of critical infrastructure, where they have the critical infrastructure risk management planning and reporting due now in 2024. Other ones include things like government around the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's Essential 8. That's another one that needs to be considered, and state level. So there are lots of these drivers from a regulatory point of view, both local, when we talk about country, and then geographical, that may impact the selection process.
So, Mike, there's obviously these regulatory drivers, but what about, I guess, just the fact that you might have a cyber breach? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a concern and increasing on a daily basis. So we're seeing increases on a annual basis, but now split between really the business detection, post incident, and notification. And this is where the regulatory requirements are starting to come in around early notification. What we also see is we see 1 in 3, so thereabouts of 35%, include shadow data, and this is data where information assets and resources haven't really been identified within the organizations. If we use this stat, we then can drill down into a asset inventory example at a later stage. But there are other reports, like the Verizon report, that recommend certain control types. And I think that's something that's going to be clear after this discussion. There are other drivers as well, and some of those other drivers include third parties, and not only third parties asking, show me your security awareness, but also you as a supplier or a customer showing your third parties your assurance as well. So it's a two-way relationship, and if you see the interconnectiveness of third parties within an organization, where vendors or the suppliers are now integral to your business critical process. So some of those key controls may be operated whilst not owned by the vendor itself. You have to ensure that you actually understand your vendor's position and how you can present to your vendors in a secure manner and provide that level of assurance on request throughout the end-to-end service lifecycle. So what are some of those internal drivers? Some of those internal drivers include really local versus global views and the different frameworks that are on offer. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail at a later stage, but also there's things around the industry and sector specific drivers, and also the size of the organization around that scalability and granularity of the actual of the vendor or the organization itself. So when we focus,
so Mike, just on those internal drivers, Mike, is that the CISO is looking at, you know, I might be aligning with a framework, but I want to look at others, and these are the reasons to look at some of the other frameworks? Is that kind of what?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, you know, in the example of the FFIEC CAT, when now they're becoming a bit more obsolete, they're now trying to decide on which frameworks to utilize. And some of those frameworks there may be one framework they adopt, or it could be multiple frameworks that they adopt. And these are some of those key drivers around the CISO's decisioning and the business objectives, and being really driven by those business critical processes more than anything.
So Mike, we've got these control frameworks, you know, we've got some of these drivers, the regulatory drivers and so on, and we've got these frameworks. So I'm guessing it's just a matter of pick a framework, throw the controls in, and you're good to go, yeah?
Not quite. All you need is a framework. Well, it's a good starting point, but we can't stress enough we need to get it right. And these are some of the drivers to decide on what to do. Once we've got our controls identified, that's important, but it's not enough without the clear understandings of those risks. So Michael, how do we do that?
Thanks, Mike. So let's go back to some real basics, just so we're all on a level playing field around these definitions of risks and controls. Because you're right, Mike, it's not just about having a control framework and saying that you're done. It really needs to be linked to, you know, what are your risks, and that's actually what you're managing, not just aligned with a control framework. So the definition of risk under ISO 31000 is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and the definition of control is a measure that maintains or modifies risk. Now, Protecht, we turn that around a little bit to make it a little bit more around the dimensions of risk that people normally think about. So control is aimed at reducing the likelihood of a risk occurring, or reducing the impact if it were to occur. And in some cases to meet a compliance obligation, but primarily we expect that control should be in place because it is managing a risk, not just because you have to do it. So I want to take a step back and look at that from an organisational perspective, and we consider this our risk and reward framework, or the risk and reward pyramid. So all organisations will start with their vision, their mission or purpose, and that is then supported by operational objectives to achieve that mission, and strategic objectives, so things that are changing. And we call this our objectives layer. To understand those, we have an operating model. Now, the operating model is how we deliver on those operational objectives. So that can be our IT assets, our people, our resources, deliver on those operational objectives. They also have our strategic projects that are supporting those strategic objectives. And then once those projects are complete, they start delivering into the operating model and changing that operating model. And this is the objects and process layer. Now, beneath that, we then start thinking about what are the operational and financial risks that are part of that operating model. Because of the way that we operate, what risks that arise out of that operating model? And similarly for our projects, what are some of the strategic project risks that we need to be managing? So this is the risk layer. Now then, setting the foundation, we need to start thinking about how we're managing those risks from both an operational perspective as well as strategic perspective. and also managing that risk and change. And as you might expect, we call this our enterprise risk management layer. So having that strong foundation means that we can potentially have a taller pyramid and get more reward if we've got effective risk management running throughout. So Mike, that's a broad enterprise risk management approach. How does IT and cyber, ISMS, how does that fit into this framework?
Yeah, look, it fits in perfectly. And to be fair, when we talk about how the information security management system or the cyber solution fits in, it fits in with most other frameworks that we have, but it fits in at the operating model. So when we talk about the information and its security, it really does sit at that process level where we may have projects that also look after some of those specific information security tasks or deliverables. Further on, we have the information security risks, and they really sit at that operational level around our risks, and they all feed up to our enterprise risks and then the strategic and business objectives. We also have the bulk of the controls sitting under the information security management systems under the enterprise risk banner. Now, we have a specific area where we keep those called the statement of applicability. And this is where we decide on the framework, the one or multiple frameworks that we look at, and how we link that to our enterprise risks and controls. And so that sits in there quite nicely from a cyber and information security to really operationalize the whole environment and how we aggregate it up to the enterprise risk management framework, linking those risks and controls. You might be thinking, how can this then be represented to make it real? Michael, I know that at Protecht we love bow ties. What are they?
Thanks, Mike. So that does bring together risk controls in a nice visual format. And so the way we think about risk bow ties and risks is starting from that risk event. And this is usually the point at which it becomes out of your control. And sometimes we say it's the oh no moment. So if you have our risk event, we start thinking about what are the potential what's next until we get to an impact on our objectives. That link between risks being the effect of uncertainty on our objectives has to link to objectives, which may be compliance, it may be cyber breaches that result in customer harm, for example, as being objectives that you want to manage. Then we can start asking about why. Why would that happen? We start moving back until we get to some of those root causes of that particular event. And some of these can be many to many relationships. And as you can probably see, we get a bow tie kind of outline. Now, once we have addressed these causes, the events and the impacts, we can start thinking about what are the controls that map to parts of that particular bow tie. Typically preventive more towards the left, detective controls sitting more around the middle, and then our corrective or reactive controls sitting towards those objectives and impacts to reduce impacts, reduce the effect on those actual objectives. Now, we can bring compliance into this as well. Now, we would expect that for most organisations, hopefully all organisations, they will have an objective that is to comply. So if there is a compliance breach, that will be linked to an objective. However, we do also acknowledge that sometimes a control is a minimum standard that is required by some regulations. So we can link compliance obligations, which you may capture as part of your enterprise management program, and link them directly to your controls. Now, as Mike said, we love a visual bow tie. Some people may capture these more as risk statements. Here's a basic template, the risk caused by those causes, impacting on those objectives, and controlled by those controls. Now, Mike, that's a conceptual example. Do you want to maybe bring that more to life with something a bit more specific?
Yeah, let's make it real. So when we talk about the main risk event, we talk about the example of cyber intrusion. Now, as you mentioned, Michael, we have the causes on the left, and those causes are going to be built up from a number of either threat vectors or weaknesses within certain areas that we're talking about from a cause point of view. So in this example, we're going to take the asset management side, and we're going to look at it from the vulnerability causes on the left, how they lead to unauthorized access, and the main event of cyber intrusion, to our risk events and impacts on the right. So the risk events on the right being system disruption, ransom data, and then either customer reputational damage or financial loss. In order to address some of these causes, we assign controls, and this is where we identify those controls and identify the effectiveness of those controls. In the example that we're going to use, we're creating a statement around the main risk event of cyber intrusion. We're going to utilize vulnerabilities and assets and how we manage that particular risk through the asset management control to then create a risk statement. So effectively, the risk statement is going to be using the main event, the risk of cyber intrusion caused by assets being vulnerable, which may impact on the reputation, are controlled or managed by the asset inventory control. So this would be a risk statement to actually address this very simplified version of a main risk event that we may have. So at the end of the slide, we effectively lead to the control frameworks. And so we don't pick specifically one control, but we highlight the distinction between the controls for compliance and controls. Now, we do that through understanding around the framework itself. So what is the structure of the framework and which framework should we select? Most of these frameworks are a set of industry authority documents, and so we can utilize those and really leverage the key components of those particular frameworks. So the idea behind them is that we commonly use these frameworks, which give us expected control objectives. And they may also give us those minimum requirements or standards so that we can adhere to those and be baselined across multiple areas. However, some of these frameworks do have some different structures. Now, a typical structure would be the links of like a level 1, level 2 with a control objective or a requirement. And if we break that down a little bit further, we could use an example like NIST CSF, which is a common cybersecurity control framework where we have NIST functions broken down into categories and the control with the control objective. Now, these types of frameworks really assist us in understanding the business alignment and those business risks and impacts based on that control level. If we drill down just a little bit further into some of those other frameworks, we actually see a number of the control frameworks highlighted on the left-hand side and really some of those dependencies on choosing those frameworks. Now, we have some pretty common frameworks here around the likes of ISO, CIS, SOC 2, NIST CSF, and you can see that we break some of these down. This example is NIST CSF, broken down into its functions, and these are very much aligned to our business categories of how do we govern our controls, how do we govern our environments, how do we identify, how do we protect, so on and so forth, where we can then break down those individual controls under each of those functions, and then the control objectives in the subcategories themselves. Now, this is just an example of the NIST CSF framework, and this is version 2 with the new govern function. But some of the other frameworks are very similar in their construction. If we move on,
why are there?
Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just saying, Mike, why are there so many, and why can't they all just agree, what those minimum controls should be?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I'm glad you asked it. It depends on the number of factors, right? We've talked about the industry size and why are there so many, because it does depend on how granular you want to go to your control environment. And like I mentioned, NIST CSF is very much aligned to business requirements as well. So the business understands some of these functions. But when we get to the larger organizations that may need to comply against certain regulatory requirements, or they may need to certify particular business units, they really do need to go down to a lower level of control. And some of those controls are very prescriptive in how they want to implement that particular control and the information required in order to demonstrate that they're actually implemented as well. There's some of the main reasons.
So then if we think, Mike, about taking some of those controls and you might have defined your frameworks that you want to align to. Let's cover now how you might manage those frameworks and how you might map multiple frameworks, because we're seeing that being more common where there are drivers, some of them regulatory, quite often third parties asking for some of those frameworks in particular. How do we potentially align with some of those frameworks? So this is a high level flow. First of all, identifying those frameworks that you want to meet, or perhaps in some cases may need to meet. Then mapping those control frameworks, so understanding for each of the control frameworks that you've defined that you want to meet, where do they map against each other? Because I think that's the common pain point that we see, is having a control in your organization, but not knowing all of the different frameworks that it might map to. Once you've done that, identify the controls that you then do want to implement, as Mike said earlier, around statement of applicability. Document and map your actual controls that you apply in your organization. Implement some of that controls testing, the controls assurance, and have that be part of your ongoing program, and then linking that back to reporting. Now, Mike, this is a nice flow, and no one is starting from zero here, right? Many people will already be somewhere on this journey. They may have either already identified frameworks, they might have had some ad hoc controls that they've put in place. Where do you find people often on this journey, and where should they start navigating?
Yeah, look, you're right. A lot of organizations are already along this framework, but I love the simplicity of it. I think it highlights just the step-by-step process, and you could start at any point, because most frameworks, as you mentioned, have been decided by the business. And so they've decided on a particular cybersecurity framework, but still, if they haven't, they have some of those dependencies that they can rely on how to determine that. When they've got that framework, they do, though, need to really look at how they're going to map that against their compliance obligations, so policy standards, and then how they map it to assets or information resources if need to look at how they connect these particular controls and how those controls are effective against those particular assets and rolled up to the risks themselves. So there's a bit of linkage and mapping that can be done. There can also be a little bit of mapping between the control environments, and we haven't really touched on this yet, but there may be multiple control frameworks utilized where you may have multiple control frameworks, or you may want to reference multiple control frameworks when it comes to a reporting aspect. Ultimately, you need to identify those controls that are applicable to your organization, depending on your requirements and the business requirements. When you document and map those controls, that effectively then goes through the review and approval process, and that's when you can start looking at that assurance across those particular controls. So you've got everything in place, you're then doing that ongoing monitoring and assurance to effectively look at the controls either in their own form or against the assets or the linkages that they've been created. And then obviously the next step is the reporting side. So the reporting side will also look at the level of rigor based upon your controls assurance techniques. Now, if we get into a bit of the detail onto how we link those controls.
Yeah, so I think, Mike, we'll focus on two of these. So we'll really align on that mapping the control frameworks, and then we'll talk about that controls assurance and some of the testing and get a bit more detailed into some of those. So, Mike, if someone wants to map multiple frameworks, what would be the kind of steps that they would need to do?
Yeah, look, they would typically need to ensure that they have those particular functions, categories, or the different levels understood, and really looking at how the control objective is seen across those controls and those frameworks. The way that we would do that is then drill down at that control level to the control objective, and then we would link them to a enterprise library. From that enterprise library, we would then look at the assurance over that particular control library, but we would also look at how we would ensure that the consistent control characteristics are feeding into that enterprise control library. And we can then report on one or multiple control frameworks based on the assurance level of a primary framework, if we've chosen one from that perspective.
So
now,
Mike,
if we take
what
this
I'm
example,
seeing here,
sorry.
Apologies, Mike. So what I'm seeing here is that we've got these controls in the framework. So this is the description of what that control should be. And then the enterprise library this is what we actually do in our organization. This is where we capture details around frequency, cadence, who owns it, but then linking it to each of those different frameworks to this control that we've implemented aligns with these particular parts of these frameworks. Is that how that works?
Yeah, that's right. We can do it that way. We can do it in a number of ways. So we can do it at the enterprise control library, and we can also do it down at the actual control environment itself within the cybersecurity statement of applicability. So we have either a one-to-one or a many-to-one relationship that we can form there.
So let's bring that to life now, Mike. We'll take this concept and then let's use an actual control out of one of these frameworks so we can see how it works in practice.
Yeah, so again, we'll use the NIST CSF framework, and we'll break down the identify function under asset management, so the category, and then we'll look at AM1, which is around inventorying the hardware managed by the organization. So we're talking about effectively a CMDB for central management of hardware. Now, if we had this particular control under this framework, we may be able to map it with another framework, and we can do that through the control objective, and it's always at the control objective. So for ISO 27001, we'll have a similar control category, maybe a different function, but at that control objective, we'll map it and then look at how we overall map that together and test against that. And so we would then have this particular control linked to a enterprise library control so that we can perform testing at this level. And that will then aggregate the reporting up to the enterprise level.
And so here it's also then testing against not just the control that you've put in place, but testing that it meets the requirements of any of the frameworks you've mapped it to.
Yeah, that's right. So you just test once, report multiple is effectively what it is on multiple frameworks.
Which is, I think that's a big pain point that I think we see sometimes where someone is testing against a framework rather than doing a test and mapping to multiple, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It just reduces the amount of duplication and allows you to report on multiple frameworks that are linked. Huge advantage.
So let's delve a bit more into that control testing piece, Mike. And I'm thinking about this from an enterprise risk management perspective, some of the key steps in control testing. And so the first thing we always do is identify the control objectives, because if we don't know what the control is intended to do or why it exists, and this goes back to the linking it to the risks that it manages, then that makes it very hard to do the other steps. But here, I guess if we're aligning to frameworks, we've already got some of those control objectives that are articulated in those frameworks. So we have, or should have, already identified what some of those are, but maybe tailored to your organization to make sure it is managing specific risks in your organization. We then move on to assessing the design effectiveness. Is it actually designed to meet that objective? And then moving on to the operating effectiveness. Even if it is designed effectively, are people actually operating it as it is intended? So Mike, is this any different? I don't see it as potentially being any different in ISMS, but do you see any perceived differences?
Look, very similar in the way that we would look for that particular design and operating effectiveness. I guess the only difference would be that we do have some clearly defined control objectives. And in certain cases with some of the frameworks, they'll step you through the implementation procedures as well. So what do you need to expect to do and to see as artifacts in order to do that? Whereas obviously a lot of business controls, you'd be defining some of those, you'd be writing those test objectives and the test procedures and what you need to actually ensure that that's actually operating as designed. So yeah, we've got those built in. So ISO 27001 utilizes this 27002 for implementation.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Mike, because we do see a spectrum, I guess, of maturity when it comes to testing, where for some it can be just a basic assessment and just is it effective or not, versus others that really do document a broader test program and lay out templates and automate testing templates that are sent out. So there is a bit of a spectrum around maturity that we see across enterprise risk, and it's great that some of those frameworks might already have some of those, sort of testing procedures already included in some of those frameworks. Which is an awesome segue, Mike, to move us into testing rigor, which I know is a bit of a passion of yours. Do you want to talk to us about how you perceive testing rigor for cybersecurity controls?
Yeah, and it is. This is very much a passion of mine. So it's all driven by cost and level of assurance. And effectively, you're looking at the bottom left-hand quadrant, low cost, low level of assurance, but it's fairly common to start off with the likes of attestations for control owners, annual control self-assessments and basic control tests, all the way through to probably the frequency increase. So when you're talking about regular occurrences, so it could be biannual, it could be monthly, could be regular internal audits, all the way up to specialized external, maybe some real-time automated monitoring, and maybe some fully correcting controls that are being tested as well. So we have a huge spectrum, and that really drives the cost. So clearly the drivers would be using external resources for that assurance and frequency of use as well, or of testing. I think it's important to know they're effectively the two main deciders around the level of rigor.
Thanks, Mike. So if we've covered frameworks and how we can link them together, we've covered some of the testing, we've covered this primarily from an ISMS perspective, but being more on the ERM side, I'm thinking about how do we then make sure that we integrate ISMS into broader enterprise risk and some of the other specialist risk domains that we're seeing. And I think this is a really good highlight around one of the comments that you made right back at the beginning today, Mike, was trying to bring more value to, or taking out that technical detail and linking to the rest of the business and the rest of the organization. So we're seeing big drivers around operational resilience, third-party risk management. We talked about some of those regulations before. DORA, is a big one here, where it's linking all of these together. It's not really just something that can be done in isolation. And it's about making sure that we have the right tools in place to integrate that. And so in particular, think about information security management and operational resilience. What are people thinking about here? Particularly some of those operational resilience management and business managers, not just from that tech perspective. So what are the IT assets that support some of those important business services or critical operations? Where are those assets vulnerable? That's what the business wants to know, or operational resilience managers want to know. Are we actually are we supporting tolerance levels across the organization when it comes to things that are being mapped, particularly when it comes to cyber? And I guess it's not just from a disruption perspective, but there's sometimes can be an incident, a cyber incident, where you might actually want to turn off your systems because you need to contain a threat, which might then disrupt operations. So there needs to be that level of integration across all of these disciplines and really working together. Now, of course, once you bring the parties into as well, we've got this whole extra spectrum, because some of those things are outside of your control, and you're going to have third parties who support those critical operations or important business services. But you're going to need information security controls, cyber controls that are managing some of those third parties or some of the resources that those third parties provide. And in addition to that, it might not be just the third parties that are providing you resources. They might be securing your resources. They might be part of your ISMS because they provide specialist tools. And we need to think about what are the assurances we need from those third parties, maybe around their major incident management, business continuity plans. Have we asked for assurance of those? But when it comes to third-party risk management, it's not just the ISMS piece. There are other risks that the business needs to manage as well around those third parties. And you don't want that to be a silo process. You don't want to silo some of those cyber and ISMS pieces just in ISMS. You want to be able to make them part of your overall third-party risk management program. So it's really about bringing all these things together. And when we think about some of these disciplines, while there are specializations, it's really about bringing it into part of that whole enterprise risk management program and using common risk processes that we've covered today around things like control testing, That shouldn't just be the remit of an ISMS, but that should be part of your broader enterprise risk management framework so that you can bring all of those things together. Do you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, look, it's a good summary, and it's important to note that information security controls and the protection of the organization is wrapped up and incorporated into all the enterprise risk management functions. So when we talk about the cyber security and the information security management system, those controls can be operated by third parties. We need to ensure that those third parties are providing that security assurance, but also that those controls, the cyber controls, link to business critical assets or information resources which formulate those business critical processes. And that operational resiliency piece with the BCP is crucial in managing your enterprise critical business processes to deliver your strategic objectives. So we're talking about that ecosystem interconnected, and that's something that we can help assist with relation to that. I think that's the main message for this.
And we'll bring that to life a little bit later. But Mike, I now just want to talk about the who. So we've talked about these frameworks. Who in the organisation decides on what frameworks you want to map to?
Yeah, I mean, this has got to be a business driver, but ultimately we're at the Chief Information Security Officer's level when he talks about he or she or they talk about their particular framework and strategy that they want to adopt. Now that will be part of the enterprise threat and risk assessment. And there are those number of factors, mainly around the regulatory requirements that may drive it. So government factors for particular frameworks. Are we considering where we're located? So is there a specific framework due to our jurisdiction? The size of the organization, I think, is important. And then, what capacity do we have? So effectively, the key operators and owners of those cybersecurity controls work with the business based on their key objectives. And then we get to the next level, which is more around, so who operates those and who manages those and who maps those. That could be a combination of, if it's an IT general control or if it's a specific cyber control, it may be at that head of or at that practitioner's level from a cyber or an IT department. And ultimately, who's making sure you meet those requirements? Now, that could be done at a multiple of levels as well. So that could be done at line 1, line 2, line 3. Typically speaking, line 1 and under the cyber team would be looking at maybe some of the assurance around, are they being reviewed? Are they meeting the ultimate requirements for the business? So there's some of those roles and responsibilities.
Thanks, Mike. Now, let's jump into maybe a bit more detail around those roles and responsibilities. And this is how I think about things from a broader enterprise perspective, and I want to see if it aligns with cyber as well. So if we think about people who own controls, we usually do typically think about them as being in line 1, the frontline business. And there may be different control operators, but also being in line 1. So there might be someone who's responsible or accountable for making sure the control is operating, but someone else might be operating it on their behalf. But then if we start talking about control testing, I would primarily see this being a line 1 role, but potentially line 2, line 3, providing additional support where required, and also identifying improvements. They might suggest improvements, but I would suggest that the line 1 teams should be implementing improvements, should be changing controls if line 2 or line 3 identify gaps, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and so on. So does that track to how that fits in an ISMS program as well?
Yeah, it does, exactly. I mean, we've talked about line 1 being the owner, operator, tester, and remediation improvement piece as well. But then obviously the line 2 and line 3 have skin in the game because, we use those 3 lines of defense to ensure we can reduce that overall risk for the control weaknesses against those information resources particularly. So yes, line one, in multiple companies that I work for, line one, we've done all of that, but we've been reviewed and challenged and also then assessed externally or internally to ensure that we provide those remediation activities. But those remediation activities have to be approved because, if line one are implementing them, they have to approve them, but come back with reasonable timeframes on delivery as well. And if they can't deliver them, then potentially the next steps would be the more like risk acceptances if they're within tolerance, of course.
And Mike, just thinking about that line one piece, and that ideally you want the front line to be testing, but there's a preference, a clear preference for if someone is operating the control or onto the control, you might want someone independent of them, even if they're in line one, to be testing that control. But when it comes to some information security controls, there can be some very technical expertise that's needed. So that might need to be outsourced. Would you still say that's a line one function?
Look, it could be done at a line one level, outsourced, because if they've actually instigated that, they'll be reporting to the line one management. Now, that's not to say that line two or line three can't also do that. And it's who are they reporting to as to which function is instigating that particular assurance technique. Now, all three lines can do that, but as per my rigor table that we talked about beforehand, that increases the cost significantly. So getting those external experts to do this level of testing increases potentially the rigor, but most certainly increases the cost of doing it. So a lot of teams want to do it internally first to make sure they're doing it against their baselines. And because they're using these control frameworks, it's very clear cut as to what they need to deliver in order to ensure that those controls are operating effectively. That's generally what we see.
I'll just close out there with boards and committees overseeing effectiveness of internal controls. And I just want to go back, I guess, to the regulatory landscape as well. So something we've seen in Australia is from the Corporate Regulator Act, some commentary that boards are on notice, around cyber. We haven't seen any enforcement action directly against boards, but there is more focus that boards need to be aware of what's happening from a cyber perspective in their organisations as well. So, Mike, let's move on then to the when. What are some of the drivers around control testing? We talked earlier on about, I guess, third parties, people asking you for certifications as being potentially one of the drivers. What are some of these drivers around control testing?
Yeah, look, there are a number of drivers, and we can break them down simply by external demand and internal demand. So external, as we mentioned, on a number of occasions, just reiterating, third parties can demand both ways, really the frequency and the type of control testing. Also the regulators, and we've discussed those on a number of occasions, based upon specific requirements. So when we talk about the security of critical infrastructure, we talk about APRA requirements, so on and so forth. And then also if you wanted to be certified as well, so if you were going down certification route for a particular business or organization, that may be an external driver. Internal drivers are things like the level of risk, that your appetite, and that you've set for your tolerances. Also, that may drive some of those risk metrics and those key control indicators as well. So you may have some key control indicators, either manual or automated, that also can increase or change that demand. Now that's driven by the capability internally. And so, that could be around your resources, your capacity of what you've actually got internally, and how much money you're willing to spend, how big the organization is. And also we talked about the skills level as well. That skills level is important because, it will increase cost, time, potentially, if you're outsourcing that based on lack of skills and specialization that we've talked to. The capability may be increased through automation, but automation is a two-way streak in that, it can actually, it needs to be tested as well to make sure the automation is actually doing what it says it's doing. But also you need to be able to identify that automation and maybe look at even integration with your tool sets. So, that can really determine the frequency across them all.
And I like here, Mike, the key control indicators being a good way to be more dynamic. So rather than just being on an annual basis, if there are key control indicators you've put in place that might provide, by its title, an indicator that movement control might not be working as intended, we need to go and maybe do a more thorough test and find out why that's the case. So it's much more risk-driven as opposed to regulatory certification compliance type activities, and more, are we actually managing this risk effectively?
Yeah, that's right. And that could have different frequencies, as you mentioned, but most of the time you want to make them nice and clear and simple, and you've understood where that information is coming from a consistent point of view as well. It's always important.
Yeah. And so I think in terms of operationalizing this then, Mike, you would set some of these cadences. You might have some automated scheduling, some of these tests that are issued out to individuals to complete. And then the KCIs, for example, might have something that is like an on-demand sort of approach, or a triggered approach that helps you align those.
Yeah, so we could use them to assist in control monitoring, where we've got some of those automatic indicators, and we talked about we could gather those, or we could have integration from other IT or cyber operational systems that give us that indication, that allow us to then work out if we need to test against a specific control or not. That's one way of using it. Yeah.
Awesome. So, Mike, we've now mapped some of these control frameworks. We've identified all the controls we want to implement. We've started doing controls testing. Now, one of the things we talked about earlier was reporting. How do we then build all that into a bit of a reporting engine to make sure that we can inform decisions? And really, we see three main purposes to reporting. So one is to provide assurance, and especially when we're talking about frameworks, we talk about assurance against some of those frameworks. To provide warnings, red flags, puffs of smoke that might indicate we might need to take some action, and then also to assist people to make informed decisions. So this is something we're currently experimenting with, is a controls dashboard that includes a framework piece. So actually mapping those controls against particular frameworks. So Mark, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about this one?
Yeah, look, this brings together what we've wrapped up really with the different control frameworks that we may utilize. So here we may have some frameworks that are cybersecurity frameworks. We're able to see at a point in time where the controls are either effective, partial, or not effective, and work out just visually what that particular gap may be between the frameworks. That gives us so much power in where we may be testing one of those control frameworks, and then it's indicating on other frameworks that we're not meeting that, so we can look at what that gap is and then drill into that particular framework into more detail. If we do drill into one of those frameworks, we get a specific report that may look something like this. And this could be the ISO framework report that gives us details about the framework, where all those links are, what are some of those controls that are linked within other frameworks, overall effectiveness, ultimate scores. We can look at how we look at the maturity of it against our targets. So we can really set some of those up as to the maturity of our overall framework, and then drill down into each of those different framework functions, categories, sections, and individual controls to look at the count, the linkages, and obviously frameworks where they have gaps and controls where they have gaps, and potentially where we may have open issues that we need to address. And all of these can be ultimately exported as well. But typically speaking, this gives us a nice wrap up of each of the frameworks that we drill down into.
Awesome. And so the way, so this is against particularly ISO in this particular example. If I take a step back now and think about that integration we talked about before with a broader enterprise risk management framework, we can then look at the controls across the whole organization, including those ISMS controls. And so this is around controls assurance, this particular dashboard, and look at what are the risks that we need to perhaps investigate, or we might have a higher exposure to because we've got some controls that are ineffective. And I think in this one we might have data integrity as being one of those risks that perhaps might align with some of those controls that are being tested in the ISMS, but are then rolled up into this dashboard. Now we look at this is the controls assurance piece, but then we want to bring it up to the enterprise level and have an integrated dashboard that covers all of that enterprise risk management data. And so we call that risk in motion at Protecht. And so that takes a look at either a business unit or perhaps a risk domain, and then pulls all of the information that we have across, whether it's risks, controls, attestations, all the different components of an enterprise risk management framework. In this case, we're highlighting here the controls part, but we can then link that across all of those different pieces of data, which really allows people to have much more power in where do I need to drill into? Where are we not doing well, either at a broader process level or delving down into that ISMS level. So Mike, that brings us to the close of our webinar today. Any final conclusions from you?
Yeah, look, we've covered a lot. Most importantly, it's about how we integrate each of those frameworks at whichever level we're talking about. So in this case, it might be the cyber level at a particular framework or multiple frameworks, how we align those frameworks with our critical information resources and our business processes, and then how we aggregate the view across our enterprise risk profiles. I think that is crucially important to then ensure that we're driving that business objective and the strategic objectives against the organization. And look, I think it's important to note that there is reporting at all levels as well. So whoever you are in the organization, you're able to see at any point your detail about your risks and your controls in your particular area.
Yeah, I think I'm much the same, Mike. It's very much about how, if you're looking at multiple frameworks especially, that's a real big pain point that we found for a lot of our customers. So trying to find a way to link those easily and then automate a lot of that process, particularly around things like testing and linking that data together to have information at your fingertips that you can then use to inform actions, make sure you're running an efficient process.
Yeah.
So with that, if you are interested in finding a little bit more about any of our controls information, we have our Protecht ERM solution, which covers a lot of the things that we have just talked about today around mapping frameworks, controls assurance and testing, and linking that to that broader enterprise risk management framework, including third-party risk management and operational resilience. You can also visit our Knowledge Hub.
And
our next webinar is on AI risk and cyber, of course, Mike, sorry. And we've got an AI risk controls webinar coming up in November. We also have a new ebook out on mastering controls for risk management. So please head over to our Knowledge Hub where you can read all about that and other blogs and content there. And finally, Protecht Academy, we do have a controls design and assurance course, which is specifically designed around building out a controls framework. We do have subscription models, so if you are interested in finding out a bit more about Protecht Academy for either your whole organization or specialist courses for your risk team, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So thank you all to everyone for joining us today. Please stay on the line for another 30 seconds or so, just so you can complete our after event survey. And we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Mike.
Cheers. Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye.